The thermometer inside Matthias Reinhardt's shelter read 23 degrees on a January night in 1842, when the temperature outside had dropped to -20. His neighbors in their traditional log cabins burned wood constantly just to keep water from freezing, while Matthias sat comfortably in his hay-wrapped Quonset with a fire he only tended twice a day. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier wisdom move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an innovation even more unbelievable than this one. The metal shelter was a mistake from the beginning, though Matthias Reinhardt did not realize it until too late. He had purchased the curved steel structure in the fall of 1841 from a military surplus auction in St. Louis. The Army had experimented with prefabricated metal shelters for frontier outposts, then abandoned the design as impractical. Matthias bought it for $37, convinced he had found a bargain that would save him weeks of cabin construction time. The structure was ingenious in theory. Curved steel panels bolted together to form a semi-cylindrical shelter 16 feet wide and 24 feet long. It could be assembled in 3 days with 2 men working. The metal was sturdy, fireproof, and required no chinking or maintenance like log construction. Matthias and his partner, Ernst Kohler, hauled the disassembled panels into the Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory that October, and erected the shelter on a clearing near a reliable creek. They were trapping partners who had worked together for 4 seasons. Ernst was a German immigrant who had come west in 1836. He was methodical, skilled with his hands, and remarkably patient with the solitary nature of mountain trapping. Matthias had grown up in Pennsylvania, learned blacksmithing from his father, and headed west in 1838 seeking freedom and profit that civilized life could not provide. They made a good team. The Quonset went up quickly. By mid-October, they had it assembled. A wooden door frame installed at one end, and a small window cut into the curved wall. They installed a simple sheet metal stove with a pipe that vented through a hole cut in the metal roof. The interior was spacious compared to typical log cabins. The curved walls created more usable floor space than squared corners. They built sleeping platforms along both sides, storage shelves at the back, and had room for their trapping equipment and supplies. Standing inside the completed structure that first evening, both men felt satisfied with their efficiency. The first cold nights in November revealed the problem. Metal conducted heat with brutal efficiency. Every degree of warmth their stove produced flowed directly through the steel walls into the frigid air outside. They woke to frost on the interior walls. Water left in cups overnight froze solid. The stove had to burn continuously just to keep the temperature tolerable, consuming firewood at an alarming rate. By early December, they had burned through what should have been a winter supply of wood. Ernst suggested they build a log cabin and abandon the metal shelter, but Matthias resisted. They had invested time and money in the Quonset. Building a cabin in winter was possible, but miserable work. Matthias convinced Ernst they could solve the problem by burning more wood and wearing extra layers inside. It was a decision Matthias would regret for the rest of his life. December 1841 brought temperatures that tested every structure in the Bitterroot Valley. Traditional log cabins, built with proper chinking and thick walls, struggled to maintain warmth. Matthias and Ernst's metal Quonset became a frozen tomb they happened to sleep in. The curved steel walls radiated cold inward with such intensity that frost formed in intricate patterns across the interior surface. Their breath hung visible in the air even with the stove burning at full capacity. Ernst developed a cough in mid-December. At first it seemed minor, the kind of winter ailment that plagued most mountain men at some point. But the constant exposure to cold weakened his body's ability to fight the infection. He continued checking trap lines because they needed the income and because stopping felt like admitting defeat. The cough worsened. By Christmas, Ernst was spending more time in his bedroll than out of it. Matthias took over most of the trapping duties. He checked both their trap lines, processed pelts, and maintained the camp while Ernst rested. The work was exhausting, made worse by the brutal cold. Every evening, Matthias returned to the shelter to find Ernst shivering despite multiple blankets. The stove burned constantly, but could not overcome the metal wall's heat conductivity. Matthias began sleeping in his coat and gloves. On January 3, 1842, a cold front moved through that dropped temperatures to levels neither man had experienced. The thermometer Matthias kept inside the shelter registered -4 degrees. Outside, he estimated it reached -30 or colder. The stove glowed red from constant firing. They burned through a week's worth of firewood in 2 days. Nothing helped. The metal walls pulled heat away faster than any fire could replace it. Ernst's condition deteriorated rapidly. His cough became violent. He developed a fever that Matthias could feel through layers of blankets. Frostbite blackened 3 of Ernst's toes, despite never removing his boots. The combination of respiratory infection and extreme cold exposure created a situation beyond Matthias's ability to address. He considered trying to transport Ernst to the nearest settlement, but the journey would take 4 days in good weather. In this cold, moving him would guarantee death. Ernst died on January 7th in the early morning hours. Matthias woke to find his partner motionless in the bedroll across from his own. The shelter had been quiet for several hours. No coughing, no shifting in the blankets. Matthias knew before checking that Ernst was gone. The cold had won. The metal shelter that was supposed to make frontier life easier had created conditions that killed a healthy man in his prime. Matthias sat with Ernst's body until dawn. The temperature inside the shelter hovered near 0, despite the stove burning steadily. Outside, the sun rose on a landscape so cold that trees cracked from frozen sap. Matthias understood with absolute clarity that he should have died too. Only luck, and perhaps a slightly stronger constitution, had kept him alive. The metal shelter was a death trap. He had known it for weeks, but had refused to act. That refusal had cost Ernst his life. Matthias spent 2 days digging Ernst's grave. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep. He built fires on the spot he had selected, let them burn for hours to thaw the earth, then dug until he hit frozen ground again. The process repeated. Build fire, wait, dig, hit frozen earth. Build another fire. It took 48 hours of continuous work to excavate a hole deep enough to prevent scavengers from reaching the body. He buried Ernst on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had trapped together for 4 seasons. The grave was simple, no marker except a pile of stones Matthias gathered from the creek bed. Words felt inadequate, so Matthias worked in silence. He wrapped Ernst's body in blankets, lowered it into the frozen ground, and filled the hole. The physical labor kept him warm. The knowledge that his stubbornness had contributed to Ernst's death kept him awake at night. Returning to the metal shelter after the burial felt like entering a tomb. Every surface reminded Matthias of his failure. Ernst's empty bedroll, the shelf where Ernst kept his personal items, the corner where Ernst sharpened his skinning knives. Matthias considered abandoning the structure entirely, but winter still held the mountains firmly. Leaving would mean a dangerous journey through deep snow and extreme cold. Building a new cabin would take weeks he did not have, so he stayed in the metal shelter and became obsessed with the problem that had killed his partner. Heat loss, thermal conductivity, the physics of why metal made such a terrible building material in extreme cold. Matthias had practical knowledge of metalworking from his blacksmithing background. He understood that metal conducted heat. He had simply underestimated how catastrophically that property would function in a dwelling. He began measuring everything. He tracked the stove's wood consumption. He monitored interior temperatures at different times of day and with different fire intensities. He went outside during cold nights and placed his hand against the metal wall, feeling the warmth radiating away into the darkness. The metal was efficiently transferring every bit of heat. directly through the walls. No insulation, no air gap, just bare metal conducting heat from inside to outside with perfect efficiency. The question that consumed Matthias was simple. How could he stop the heat loss? Traditional log cabins worked because wood was a poor conductor of heat. The logs themselves provided insulation. Even with gaps in the chinking, a log cabin retained warmth far better than bare metal. But Matthias could not transform his metal shelter into logs. He needed a different solution. He needed to create insulation where none existed. He needed to add a barrier between the metal and the outside air that would interrupt the heat transfer. The obsession gave him purpose beyond grief. Every day he checked his trap lines and thought about thermal barriers. Every night he fed the stove and calculated heat loss. The metal shelter had killed Ernst. Matthias would make sure it never killed anyone again. Matthias began observing how animals survived winter. This was not new knowledge for a mountain man. Every trapper understood that animals had strategies for dealing with cold. But Matthias started paying attention with a specific question in mind. How did animals create insulation? What natural methods existed for retaining warmth in extreme conditions? Bears hibernated in dens, insulated by earth and sometimes snow. The soil provided a thermal barrier. The den's small entrance minimized heat loss. Matthias spent an afternoon examining an abandoned bear den he found while checking trap lines. The interior chamber was surprisingly warm compared to outside air temperature, not from any heat source, but from the insulation provided by several feet of earth on all sides. The principle was clear. Mass between inside and outside reduced heat transfer. Rabbits and other small mammals burrowed beneath the snow. Matthias dug down into a snowdrift and measured the temperature at different depths. On a day when surface air was 5 degrees, the temperature 2 feet under the snow was 28 degrees. Snow itself was an insulator. The air pockets between ice crystals prevented heat transfer. Animals living beneath snow were protected by a natural insulation layer. Birds fluffed their feathers to create air pockets. Matthias watched chickadees in the willows near camp. In extreme cold, they became nearly spherical as they expanded their plumage. The trapped air between feathers acted as insulation. The birds were not generating more heat, they were simply preventing heat loss more effectively. The principle appeared again. Air pockets interrupted thermal conductivity. The pattern repeated everywhere Matthias looked. Effective insulation involved creating barriers that interrupted heat transfer. Dense material worked. Air pockets worked. Combinations of both worked even better. The question became how to apply these natural principles to his metal shelter. He could not bury it in earth like a bear den. He could not rely on snow that would melt in spring. He needed something practical, available, and effective. Matthias expanded his observations to the settlement's infrastructure. He visited other trappers' cabins and paid attention to construction details he had previously ignored. He noticed that cabins with thick moss chinking between logs stayed warmer than those with minimal chinking. The moss created an insulating layer that reduced air infiltration. He saw one cabin where the trapper had packed dried grass between inner and outer wallboards. That cabin was notably warmer than similar structures. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Matthias was passing through the small settlement of Stevensville in late January to trade pelts when he stopped at a barn. The structure housed cattle through winter. Despite bitter cold outside, the barn interior felt surprisingly warm, not from stoves or fires, but from animal body heat retained by the building's construction. Matthias studied the barn carefully. Heavy timber frame, board walls. And along one wall, hay bales stacked from floor to ceiling serving as both storage and insulation. He placed his hand against the barn wall behind the hay bales. Cold. He placed his hand on the interior side of the haystack. Warm. The hay bales were acting as insulation, creating a thermal barrier between the cold wall and the warm interior. Matthias became fascinated with hay bales in a way that would have seemed absurd to anyone who did not understand his obsession. He returned to the barn in Stevensville 3 times over the following week, studying the haystacks with the intensity of a man examining gold ore. The barn owner, a settler named Joseph Kern, tolerated Matthias's strange behavior with bemused patience. When Matthias finally explained what he was investigating, Joseph offered information that proved crucial. Compressed hay bales were relatively new to the frontier. The mechanical hay press had been invented in the East in the 1830s, and a few had made their way to Western settlements by the early 1840s. Before hay presses, loose hay was simply stacked. Compressed bales were denser, easier to transport, and more weather-resistant. Joseph had purchased a small hay press the previous summer and produced approximately 200 bales from his fields. Matthias asked to examine a single bale closely. Joseph brought one from the stack. The bale was rectangular with slightly rounded corners, bound with wire twisted tight. It measured roughly 14 inches by 18 inches by 36 inches and weighed approximately 60 pounds. Matthias pressed his hand against it. The surface was firm but yielded slightly under pressure. The compressed grass created a dense mass, but not solid. Air remained trapped between individual strands of hay. This was the critical insight. Compressed hay was not a solid material like wood or stone. It was thousands of individual grass stems pressed together, creating countless tiny air pockets throughout the bale's interior. Those air pockets acted as thermal barriers. Heat, trying to pass through the bale, had to transfer through alternating layers of grass fiber and trapped air. The process was slow and inefficient, which made hay an excellent insulator. Matthias borrowed a bale from Joseph and took it back to his camp. He conducted a crude experiment. He heated a flat stone in his stove until it was too hot to touch, then placed the hay bale over it. He monitored the top surface of the bale. After 15 minutes, the top surface was barely warm. After 30 minutes, it was noticeably warm, but not hot. The bale was interrupting heat transfer with remarkable efficiency. A stone that hot exposed directly to air would cool in minutes. Under the hay bale, it retained heat far longer. He tested the bale in reverse. He placed it outside overnight when temperatures dropped below 0. In the morning, he brought it inside and cut it open. The exterior 2 inches of hay were frozen stiff. The interior was merely cold, not frozen. The bale's mass and air pockets had prevented deep cold penetration. Even without any heat source, the insulating properties were evident. Matthias understood he had found his solution. Hay bales were available. They were affordable. A single bale cost roughly 15 cents, far less than equivalent amounts of lumber or other building materials. Most importantly, they possessed the exact property he needed: the ability to interrupt thermal conductivity through a combination of mass and trapped air. Compressed hay bales could transform his metal shelter from a death trap into a survivable dwelling. The question was how to apply them effectively. Matthias spent a week planning before taking any action. His blacksmithing background had taught him that execution without planning led to wasted materials and failed projects. He needed to understand exactly how to apply hay bale insulation to a curved metal structure before he began stacking bales. The challenge was more complex than simply piling hay against walls. The first problem was geometry. His Quonset shelter was 16 feet wide, creating a semicircular profile with an 8-foot radius. Hay bales were rectangular. Stacking rectangular objects against a curved surface would create gaps unless he planned the arrangement carefully. Matthias drew diagrams in a notebook he used for tracking trap locations. He sketched the shelter's profile and experimented with different bale positioning patterns. He determined that positioning bales lengthwise against the curve would minimize gaps. A 36-inch bale placed lengthwise would span a larger arc of the curve than the same bale placed widthwise. The rounded corners of the bales would also help them nestle together with minimal space between. He calculated that stacking bales in horizontal rows, each bale tight against the next, would create a reasonably continuous insulation layer around the shelter's curved walls. The second problem was thickness. A single layer of hay bales would provide approximately 14 inches of insulation based on the bale's width. Matthias suspected this might not be sufficient for extreme cold. 2 layers would provide 28 inches of insulation, which seemed more appropriate for Montana winter conditions. However, 2 layers meant twice as many bales and twice the cost. He did calculations based on the shelter's dimensions. The Quonset was 24 feet long and had a curved surface area requiring coverage. Accounting for the semicircular profile and adding coverage for the end wall with the door, he estimated needing approximately 140 bales for a single layer and 280 bales for 2 layers. At 15 cents per bale, 2 layers would cost $42. This was more than he had paid for the shelter itself, but less than Ernst's life was worth. The third problem was moisture. Hay bales exposed to weather would absorb moisture and eventually rot. Montana's climate was relatively dry, but snow would accumulate on the bales. Spring rains would saturate them. Matthias needed to protect the hay from moisture while still maintaining its insulating properties. He considered several approaches. Canvas covering was too expensive and difficult to secure over such a large, irregular surface. Birch bark might work, but would require enormous quantities. Pine pitch coating was waterproof, but flammable. The solution came from observing snow accumulation. Snow on top of hay bales would actually add insulation value while protecting the hay beneath from direct moisture exposure. The snow would compact and create an additional barrier. In spring, he could remove accumulated snow before major melting occurred. For the sides, he would position the bales slightly away from ground contact to prevent wicking moisture from soil. The bales themselves would shed most precipitation due to their compressed nature and the natural water resistance of dried grass. The fourth problem was access. He needed to maintain the ability to enter and exit the shelter. Simply stacking bales against the door would trap him inside. He would need to build a channel through the insulation layer at the doorway, creating an insulated entrance passage that maintained thermal integrity while allowing movement. Matthias returned to Stevensville in early February with money from his winter trapping. He approached Joseph Kern about purchasing hay bales in quantity. Joseph was surprised by the request. Most people bought hay for livestock feed, not by the hundreds. When Matthias explained his intention to stack bales around his metal shelter for insulation, Joseph's expression shifted from confusion to poorly concealed amusement. He agreed to sell 280 bales at 15 cents each, but his skepticism was obvious. The transaction took 2 days. Joseph helped Matthias load bales onto a borrowed wagon, 20 bales at a time. Matthias made 14 round trips between Stevensville and his camp, each journey taking most of a day. The work was exhausting, but by mid-February he had 280 compressed hay bales stacked near his metal shelter. The pile represented $42 and countless hours of hauling. It also represented the most expensive and labor-intensive insulation project anyone in the Bitterroot Valley had attempted. Word of Matthias's hay purchase spread quickly through the small frontier community. Settlers and trappers talked. A man buying nearly 300 hay bales for construction instead of livestock feed was noteworthy. When people learned he intended to stack the bales around his metal shelter, the mockery began. Some of it was good-natured. Some was genuinely concerned that grief over Ernst's death had affected Matthias's judgment. A trapper named Wilhelm Brenner stopped at Matthias's camp in late February. Wilhelm was German, like Ernst had been, and he had known both men for several years. He examined the pile of hay bales and the metal shelter with obvious confusion. Wilhelm asked directly if Matthias understood that hay was for feeding animals, not building houses. Matthias explained his reasoning about thermal insulation, heat transfer, and the properties of compressed hay. Wilhelm listened politely, but his expression made clear he thought Matthias was wasting time and money. Other reactions were less diplomatic. A group of trappers passing through on their way to spring trapping grounds stopped to watch Matthias begin positioning bales against the shelter walls. One man loudly proclaimed that Matthias had clearly lost his mind to grief. Another suggested the metal shelter had frozen Matthias's brain. A third joked that Matthias was building a house for his hay instead of building a house for himself. They rode away laughing. The criticism stung more than Matthias wanted to admit. He understood their perspective. Hay was valuable as animal feed, especially on the frontier where winters were long, and fodder was crucial for livestock survival. Using hundreds of bales for construction seemed wasteful. The visual absurdity of stacking hay around a building added to the mockery. It looked strange. It defied conventional frontier construction wisdom. But Matthias had buried his partner in frozen ground after watching him die from cold in a shelter that should have protected him. He had spent weeks studying thermal properties and natural insulation methods. He had tested hay's insulating capacity and understood the physics behind why it would work. The mockery was irrelevant compared to the certainty that his solution was sound. He continued working, stacking the first bales against the curved metal walls, beginning the process that would transform his shelter from a frozen death trap into something revolutionary. Matthias began stacking hay bales against the metal shelter's curved walls on February 20th, 1842. The process required more precision than he had anticipated. Each bale weighed approximately 60 pounds and needed careful positioning to create a tight, continuous layer. He started at one end of the Quonset and worked methodically along the curved wall, placing bales lengthwise against the metal surface. The rounded corners of the compressed bales proved advantageous. Where Matthias had worried about gaps between rectangular objects following a curve, the bale's rounded edges allowed them to nestle together with minimal space. He pushed each bale firmly against the previous one, creating pressure that compressed them slightly together. The result was a nearly continuous wall of hay following the shelter's semicircular profile. The physical work was demanding, lifting 60-pound bales repeatedly, positioning them precisely, adjusting placement to minimize gaps. Matthias worked alone, which slowed progress but gave him complete control over quality. He refused to accept gaps larger than an inch between bales. When spacing exceeded that threshold, he repositioned bales until they fit tighter. Perfection was impossible with rectangular objects on a curved surface, but excellence was achievable through patience. The first complete layer around the shelter's perimeter took 9 days. Matthias worked from dawn until dark, stopping only to check trap lines every third day. He stacked bales from ground level to approximately 6 feet high, covering the lower 2/3 of the curved walls. The upper curve of the Quonset remained exposed. This was intentional. Matthias wanted to test the partial insulation's effectiveness before committing resources to complete coverage. Even incomplete, the visual effect was striking. The metal shelter disappeared behind a wall of golden compressed hay. The structure transformed from a simple curved metal building into something that resembled a massive haystack with a door. Matthias understood why neighbors found it absurd. It looked ridiculous. But appearance meant nothing if the insulation performed as predicted. He noticed immediate effects even with incomplete coverage. Interior temperature stability improved. The constant heat drain that had characterized winter in the bare metal shelter diminished noticeably. Morning temperatures inside averaged 5 to 7 degrees warmer than they had been before insulation. The metal walls behind the hay bales no longer radiated intense cold inward. His stove burned less wood for equivalent warmth. These early results encouraged Matthias, but did not satisfy him. Partial insulation was merely an improvement. He wanted transformation. He wanted the shelter genuinely comfortable in extreme cold. That required complete coverage, including the upper walls and the end walls. It required the second layer of bales that would double the insulation thickness. Most importantly, it required solving the entrance problem. The doorway remained an open gap in his insulation layer. Cold poured through that opening, undermining the thermal barrier he was creating. Matthias needed to design an entrance passage that maintained insulation integrity while allowing access. He spent 2 days sketching solutions before beginning construction on the entrance channel that would complete his revolutionary design. The entrance passage required solving 2 problems simultaneously. Matthias needed access through the insulation layer while preventing cold air from flowing directly to the metal shelter's door. His solution drew inspiration from animal burrows and traditional frontier root cellars. He would create an angled entrance channel through the hay bale walls, similar to how a badger's den entrance turned before reaching the main chamber. He built a wooden frame using split logs to create the passage structure. The frame started at the exterior face of the hay bale wall and angled inward toward the actual shelter door. The passage was 30 inches wide, tall enough to walk through while slightly bent, and extended approximately 4 feet through what would become the double-thick insulation layer. The angled design meant cold air entering the passage would not flow directly to the door. Matthias stacked hay bales around and over this wooden frame, creating walls and a ceiling for the entrance tunnel. The bales formed a compressed hay passage that maintained insulation continuity while providing access. He positioned bales carefully so their weight pressed down on the wooden frame, creating structural stability. The passage entrance faced slightly downward, which would prevent snow accumulation and encourage cold air to sink away rather than flow inward. The door itself required modification. Matthias built a second door at the outer entrance of the passage, creating an airlock effect. Someone entering would open the outer door, step into the hay-insulated passage, close the outer door, then open the inner door to the shelter. This prevented direct cold airflow from outside to inside. The technique was common in barns and root cellars, but unusual for dwelling structures. Moisture management became critical as Matthias completed the first layer and began the second. He had observed that compressed hay bales shed rain reasonably well due to their density, but prolonged exposure to moisture would eventually cause rot. Snow accumulation on the bales was inevitable and actually beneficial for additional insulation, but he needed to prevent ground moisture from wicking into the bottom bales. His solution was simple but effective. He placed flat stones under each bottom row bale, elevating them roughly 3 inches above soil contact. The air gap prevented moisture wicking, while the stones distributed weight and prevented settling. For bales at ground level near the entrance where foot traffic might compact soil and create standing water, he built a shallow drainage channel that directed water away from the zombie structure. The metal shelter's roof presented another moisture concern. Snow would accumulate on top of the hay bale walls and potentially melt onto the bales below. Matthias extended the metal roof's drip edge slightly by wiring additional sheet metal pieces to create overhang. This directed snowmelt and rain away from the top of the hay walls. The solution was not perfect, but significantly reduced water exposure to the upper bales. By mid-March, Matthias had developed a comprehensive approach to moisture that would prove effective for years. Elevation prevented ground moisture, roof overhang reduced precipitation exposure, and the compressed nature of the bales themselves provided inherent water resistance. The hay would last multiple seasons with minimal degradation. Matthias began stacking the second layer of hay bales in late March. This layer required different technique than the first. Where the initial layer pressed directly against the metal shelter, the second layer rested on and against the first. The offset positioning was crucial. Matthias staggered the second layer bales so their joints did not align with joints in the first layer, similar to bricklaying patterns. This eliminated continuous gaps where cold could penetrate. The second layer added another 14 inches of insulation thickness, bringing total coverage to approximately 28 inches of compressed hay. The visual effect became even more dramatic. The metal shelter completely disappeared behind a massive hay construction that dominated the clearing. From any distance, the structure appeared to be an enormous haystack with a small entrance tunnel. Only close inspection revealed the metal building hidden inside. Wilhelm Brenner visited again in early April. He brought 2 other trappers who wanted to see Matthias's project. The 3 men stood examining the hay-wrapped shelter with expressions ranging from bewilderment to outright ridicule. One trapper asked if Matthias planned to winter his horses inside. Another suggested Matthias had confused himself with a barn. Wilhelm remained more diplomatic, but clearly considered the entire effort misguided. Matthias invited them to feel the temperature difference. He took Wilhelm to the metal wall visible inside the entrance passage where the first hay layer ended. The metal was cold to touch, but not painfully so. Then Matthias took Wilhelm outside and had him place his hand on the outer surface of the second hay layer. The exterior bales felt ambient temperature, completely disconnected from any interior warmth. Wilhelm acknowledged the temperature difference, but remained skeptical that the massive hay investment was worthwhile. The criticism reflected practical frontier values. Hay represented stored energy for livestock. Each bale Matthias used for construction was a bale unavailable for feeding animals. In a subsistence economy where every resource had immediate survival value, dedicating hundreds of bales to building insulation seemed wasteful. Most frontiersmen accepted cold as inevitable and dealt with it through clothing, fires, and endurance. Matthias understood their perspective but rejected their conclusion. Ernst had died because their shelter could not maintain livable temperatures. Matthias had nearly died for the same reason. Preventing future deaths was worth more than the conventional use of hay. The physics supported his approach. Compressed hay interrupted thermal conductivity. 2 layers of 14-inch bales created a formidable barrier to heat loss. The early results confirmed this. His shelter was warmer, with less wood consumption than any comparable structure in the valley. By late April, Matthias completed the second layer coverage, including the end walls and the area above the entrance passage. The entire metal shelter was now encased in 28 inches of compressed hay insulation on all sides. The structure was ready for the ultimate test that would come with the following winter. Spring 1842 brought warmer weather that allowed Matthias to observe his insulation system under less extreme conditions. The Montana thaw was gradual. Night temperatures still dropped below freezing through April and early May. These moderate cold periods provided opportunities to test the hay-wrapped shelter's performance without the life-threatening conditions of deep winter. Matthias established a systematic measurement routine. He kept 2 thermometers, one inside the shelter and one outside, protected from direct sun but exposed to ambient air. He recorded temperatures 3 times daily at dawn, midday, and evening. He tracked his stove's wood consumption by counting the pieces of split firewood he burned each day. He noted wind conditions, cloud cover, and precipitation. The data collection was methodical and comprehensive. The results were remarkable even in moderate cold. On nights when exterior temperatures dropped to 20 degrees, interior temperatures with a modest evening fire stabilized around 42 degrees. The shelter retained heat through the night without constant fire tending. Matthias woke to interior temperatures only 5 to 8 degrees cooler than when he banked the fire before sleep. In the bare metal shelter, overnight temperature drops had been 15 to 20 degrees, even with fires burning continuously. Wood consumption decreased dramatically. Where Matthias had burned approximately 30 pieces of split firewood daily during winter in the uninsulated shelter, he now used 8 to 12 pieces for equivalent comfort. The hay insulation was preventing heat loss so effectively that a fraction of previous heating effort maintained superior interior conditions. The economic implications were significant. Less wood meant less time spent cutting, hauling, and splitting. More time for productive trapping and less physical exhaustion from constant firewood procurement. Matthias made several refinements, based on spring observations. He noticed that the entrance passage, while effective at preventing direct cold airflow, allowed some heat escape through convection. Warm air rose and flowed out the passage, while cold air sank and entered. He addressed this by hanging a heavy blanket inside the inner door. The blanket created an additional barrier to air movement while remaining easy to push aside for entry and exit. He observed moisture accumulation on some lower bales where spring snowmelt created temporarily saturated ground. The stone foundation under most bales prevented problems, but a few areas needed additional drainage. Matthias dug shallow trenches to channel water away from the structure. He also removed and replaced 3 bales that showed early signs of moisture damage. The replaced bales had been positioned where roof runoff occasionally dripped onto them. Adjusting the roof overhang eliminated the problem. The hay itself showed surprising durability. Compressed bales maintained their shape and density through temperature fluctuations and moderate moisture exposure. The wire binding remained tight. The bales did not settle or compress significantly under the weight of upper layers. Matthias calculated that the insulation system would remain effective for multiple years with minimal maintenance. The initial investment in materials and labor would provide long-term returns in comfort, safety, and reduced heating costs. Summer brought unexpected insights about the hay insulation's properties. Matthias had designed the system for winter warmth retention, but the thick hay walls affected summer temperatures in ways he had not anticipated. Montana summers could be hot with temperatures occasionally reaching 90 degrees or higher. The metal shelter without insulation had been unbearable in summer heat. Metal absorbed solar radiation and turned the interior into an oven. The hay-wrapped shelter behaved completely differently. The thick insulation that prevented winter heat loss also prevented summer heat gain. On days when exterior temperatures reached 85 degrees, interior temperatures peaked around 70 degrees. The thermal mass of several tons of compressed hay absorbed and buffered temperature changes. The shelter stayed cool during hot days and retained moderate temperatures through cool nights. This summer performance provided additional validation of Matthias's design, but it did nothing to reduce community skepticism. Other settlers and trappers saw the massive hay-wrapped structure as evidence of eccentricity rather than innovation. The visual appearance remained absurd to conventional frontier sensibilities. A building wrapped in hay looked like a mistake, regardless of how well it performed. Wilhelm Brenner stopped by in July during a trip to check his summer trap lines. He had not seen the structure since early spring. Wilhelm examined the hay bales, noting that they had weathered several months with minimal degradation. He acknowledged that Matthias's moisture management had worked. The bales were dry, intact, and showed no significant rot. Wilhelm remained unconvinced that the entire project was worthwhile, but admitted the construction quality was solid. The conversation shifted to practical frontier economics. Wilhelm pointed out that Matthias had invested $42 in hay bales plus weeks of labor in construction. For that investment, Wilhelm argued, Matthias could have built a proper log cabin that would have been warm, conventional, and not subject to community ridicule. The hay would have fed livestock or been sold for profit. Wilhelm's logic reflected mainstream frontier thinking. Resources should serve immediate, conventional purposes. Matthias countered that his metal shelter with hay insulation was warmer than any log cabin in the valley, required less firewood, and would last longer than conventional construction. He pointed out that log cabins required constant maintenance, chinking repair, and eventually rotted at the base logs where they contacted soil. His hay insulation could be replaced in sections if needed, and the metal structure underneath would last indefinitely. Wilhelm conceded these points, but maintained that the unconventional appearance and approach made the project questionable. The exchange illustrated the fundamental barrier to innovation adoption on the frontier. Practical effectiveness mattered less than conformity to established methods. Matthias's shelter worked better than conventional cabins, but it looked wrong and violated expectations about how buildings should be constructed. Social pressure to conform to standard practices was powerful even in frontier communities that supposedly valued independence and individualism. Matthias continued his temperature measurements through summer. The data supported every claim he made about the system's performance. But data did not change minds resistant to unconventional approaches. Autumn 1842 brought preparation for the ultimate test of Matthias's hay insulation system. He had collected 9 months of temperature data, showing superior performance in spring and summer conditions. Winter would prove whether the system could protect against the extreme cold that had killed Ernst. Matthias approached the coming winter with confidence based on physics and measurement, but also with awareness that failure would mean his death. He spent September and October preparing for winter with more thoroughness than most mountain men employed. He cut and split firewood, but needed far less than previous years. His calculations suggested he would require 1/3 the wood that the uninsulated shelter had consumed. He still prepared a large supply because miscalculation could be fatal, but the reduced requirement saved enormous labor. He checked every hay bale for deterioration and replaced 5 that showed moisture damage or settling. The vast majority remained in excellent condition after 7 months. He reinforced the entrance passage where foot traffic had worn the bottom bales. He added additional stones under bales where soil had settled and created slight contact between hay and ground. He verified that his roof overhang was directing water properly and that drainage channels around the structure remained clear. Matthias also made improvements based on his spring and summer observations. He built a small covered porch over the entrance passage to provide additional weather protection and reduce snow accumulation at the entry. He installed a second interior blanket barrier to create a double airlock effect. He constructed a better ventilation system to allow moisture from cooking and breathing to escape without losing significant heat. His trap lines were established and productive. He had recovered financially from Ernst's death and the hay insulation investment. Pelts from the previous winter and spring had sold well. He had repaid the loan for the wagon he had used to haul hay bales. His camp was well organized and supplied. Everything was ready for winter except the psychological preparation for living alone through months of cold and darkness. The isolation affected Matthias more than he acknowledged. Ernst had been partner and companion. Their conversations had broken the monotony of winter trapping. Working alone was efficient but lonely. The hay-wrapped shelter felt like a monument to Ernst's death, even as it represented the solution that might have saved him. Matthias sometimes talked aloud while working, addressing comments to Ernst as if his partner could hear. The frontier made men strange in various ways. November brought the first serious cold. Temperatures dropped to 15 degrees on November 8th. Matthias lit his evening fire and monitored interior temperature. With modest heating, the shelter maintained 53 degrees through the night. He woke comfortable, used minimal firewood, and confirmed that his system performed as predicted. But November cold was mild compared to what January and February would bring. The real test remained ahead. The blizzard that would validate Matthias's innovation arrived on January 12, 1843. Weather patterns had been cold but manageable through December and early January. Matthias's shelter performed excellently in moderate cold, maintaining comfortable interior temperatures with minimal heating. Then a massive cold front swept down from Canada, bringing conditions that tested every structure and every person in the Bitterroot Valley. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 6 hours. By evening, on January 12th, Matthias's exterior thermometer registered -8 degrees. Wind screamed through the valley, driving snow horizontally and creating drifts that buried anything less than 4 feet tall. The sky disappeared behind white chaos. Visibility dropped to less than 20 yards. This was the kind of storm that killed people caught outside and made survival indoors a challenging proposition. Matthias retreated to his shelter and secured the entrance. He pushed through the outer door, moved through the hay-insulated passage, entered through the inner door, and secured both barriers behind him. The wind noise diminished immediately. The entrance passage's angled design prevented wind from blowing directly through. The double-door system with blanket barriers created an effective airlock. Inside the shelter, the storm became distant background noise rather than immediate threat. He lit his fire and began monitoring temperatures. Exterior temperature continued dropping through the evening. By midnight, his outside thermometer read -22 degrees. Wind chill made conditions far worse, though Matthias had no way to measure that factor. This was cold that killed exposed skin in minutes and made every breath painful. This was the cold that had killed Ernst. Inside the hay-wrapped shelter, temperature told a completely different story. With a modest fire burning in his stove, interior temperature stabilized at 38 degrees by midnight. Matthias was comfortable in a single layer of wool clothing. His water bucket remained liquid. His breath was visible but not freezing. The shelter was not warm by civilized standards, but it was survivable without extreme measures. The critical measurement came at dawn on January 13th. Matthias let his fire burn down to coals during the night to test heat retention. Exterior temperature had dropped to -27 degrees, the coldest reading he had ever recorded. Wind continued at dangerous speeds. Inside the shelter, despite the fire being reduced to minimal coals, temperature had dropped only to 31 degrees. The hay insulation was preventing heat loss so effectively that residual warmth from the previous evening's fire maintained above-freezing interior conditions through the coldest part of the night. Matthias added wood to rebuild the fire. Within an hour, interior temperature rose to 45 degrees. He used 9 pieces of split firewood to achieve this, approximately 1/3 of what the bare metal shelter would have required for inferior results. The mathematics was undeniable. His hay insulation system was performing exactly as physics predicted. The question was whether other structures in the valley were faring as well. The blizzard continued through January 13th and into the 14th. Matthias remained in his shelter, warm and comfortable, while the storm raged outside. He checked trap lines were impossible. Travel beyond the immediate clearing around his shelter was suicidal. He spent the time maintaining his fire, recording temperature measurements, and calculating the thermal performance he was documenting. The data confirmed what he felt physically. His shelter was maintaining interior temperatures 40 to 45 degrees warmer than exterior conditions. On January 15th, the storm broke. Wind diminished to occasional gusts. Snow stopped falling, though clouds remained thick and gray. Temperature stayed brutally cold, hovering around -15 degrees. Matthias ventured outside to assess conditions. Snow had drifted against his hay-wrapped shelter, in some places covering the lower bales completely. The entrance passage remained clear, due to its covered porch design. The structure had weathered the blizzard without any damage. He was clearing snow from around the entrance when he saw a figure approaching through the deep snow. Wilhelm Brenner was trudging toward Matthias's camp, moving slowly through drifts that reached his knees. Wilhelm's face was wrapped in layers of cloth. Ice coated his beard and eyebrows. Even from a distance, Matthias could see Wilhelm was struggling against the cold. Wilhelm reached the clearing and Matthias hurried to help him. Wilhelm's first words were a request to come inside and get warm. Matthias guided him through the entrance passage. Wilhelm's eyes widened as they moved through the hay-insulated tunnel. The temperature difference between outside and the passage interior was immediately noticeable. When they entered the main shelter, Wilhelm stopped and stared. The interior was warm. Not merely tolerable, but genuinely comfortable. Matthias's fire was burning moderately, not the roaring blaze that emergency heating required. The metal walls that should have been radiating cold were neutral to touch behind their hay insulation. Wilhelm removed his outer layers and stood near the stove, shaking from cold and exhaustion. Wilhelm's story came out slowly as he warmed. His cabin, a traditional log structure he had built 3 years earlier, had nearly killed him during the blizzard. The gaps in his chinking had allowed wind to penetrate. His door had frost on the interior despite being barred shut. His fire had burned constantly for 3 days, consuming his entire prepared wood supply and forcing him to burn furniture and parts of his interior shelving to maintain minimal heat. His water had frozen solid despite keeping it near the fire. His food stores were accessible only by chipping ice from frozen supplies. The interior temperature of his cabin had never risen above 20 degrees during the worst cold. Wilhelm had worn every piece of clothing he owned and remained dangerously cold. He had survived only because the blizzard ended before his burnable materials ran out. Wilhelm had come to Matthias seeking help and warmth, but also seeking something else. Validation that the hay-wrapped shelter was not insanity but genius. Wilhelm sat in Matthias's comfortable shelter, warm for the first time in 3 days, and understood completely that everything he had mocked was correct. Wilhelm stayed in Matthias's shelter for 6 hours while his body recovered from 3 days of extreme cold exposure. During that time, Matthias showed him the temperature records he had maintained through the blizzard. The data was simple but compelling. Exterior temperatures had reached -27 degrees. Interior temperatures had never dropped below 31 degrees despite minimal heating. The differential was 43 degrees in some measurements and never less than 38 degrees. Wilhelm examined the numbers with the attention of a man whose survival suddenly depended on understanding them. He was not educated in formal science, but frontier life taught practical evaluation of evidence. The thermometer readings were objective. The comfort level inside the shelter was undeniable. The minimal wood consumption compared to Wilhelm's desperate burning of furniture was stark contrast. Every data point supported Matthias's approach. Matthias walked Wilhelm through the technical principles. Compressed hay contained countless air pockets that interrupted thermal conductivity. The 28-inch thickness of 2 staggered bale layers created a formidable barrier to heat transfer. The entrance passage prevented direct cold air infiltration. The double-door system maintained interior air mass. The result was a shelter that retained heat with extraordinary efficiency compared to conventional construction. Wilhelm asked detailed questions about cost, construction time, and durability. Matthias provided honest answers. The hay bales had cost $42. Construction had taken approximately 6 weeks of focused work. The bales had now survived 15 months with minimal degradation and could reasonably last 3 to 5 years before requiring replacement. Replacement could be done in sections rather than completely rebuilding. The metal structure underneath would last indefinitely. Wilhelm did calculations in his head. His log cabin had cost him 8 weeks of hard labor in construction, plus ongoing maintenance every year. He spent enormous time cutting and hauling firewood to heat the poorly insulated structure. His near-death experience during the recent blizzard had proved the cabin was inadequate for extreme conditions. Building a hay-insulated shelter would cost more in materials but less in labor and would provide superior performance. The conversation shifted when Wilhelm asked if Matthias would help him build a similar structure. This was the moment when innovation moved from individual solution to community adoption. Matthias agreed immediately. He had not built the hay-wrapped shelter to keep the technique secret. He had built it to survive. If Wilhelm or anyone else wanted to adopt the approach, Matthias would share everything he had learned. Wilhelm left that afternoon, moving slowly through deep snow back to his cabin. His departure marked a turning point. The mockery that had characterized community response to Matthias's project would shift to serious interest. The blizzard had been a natural experiment that tested every structure and every heating system in the valley. Matthias's hay-wrapped shelter had performed demonstrably better than conventional construction. Performance data was more persuasive than any argument. Wilhelm returned to Matthias's camp in early February with 2 other trappers who had struggled through the blizzard. Both men wanted to see the hay-wrapped shelter and understand how it had maintained such superior warmth. Matthias gave them the same demonstration he had given Wilhelm, showing temperature records, explaining thermal principles, and walking them through the construction techniques he had developed. Word spread through the scattered frontier community with surprising speed. By late February, Matthias had received visits from 7 different trappers and settlers asking about hay bale insulation. Some were skeptical, but curious. Others had experienced near-death cold in their cabins and wanted immediate solutions. Matthias shared information freely with everyone who asked. He showed them how to stack bales for curved or flat surfaces, how to create entrance passages, how to manage moisture, and how to calculate materials needed for different structure sizes. The first adopter after Wilhelm was a trapper named Jacob Reinhold, who had a small cabin near the Clark Fork River. Jacob did not wrap his entire cabin, but added a 4-foot-thick hay bale wall on the north side where prevailing winter winds hit hardest. The partial insulation improved his cabin's heat retention noticeably. He reported using 30% less firewood after the modification and maintaining interior temperatures 10 to 15 degrees warmer than before. Wilhelm began construction on a new shelter in March. He chose to build a smaller version of Matthias's design using a surplus military tent frame covered with canvas and insulated with hay bales. The construction took 3 weeks. Wilhelm documented his process and shared results with the community. His hay-insulated tent proved warmer than his previous log cabin while requiring a fraction of the heating fuel. By summer 1843, 5 structures in the Bitterroot Valley had been modified or built using hay bale insulation principles. Each adapted the technique to their specific needs and resources. Some wrapped existing cabins partially. Others built new structures specifically designed for hay insulation. The variations proved the technique's flexibility. Compressed hay bales could insulate almost any structure type if applied thoughtfully. The social dynamic shifted dramatically. Matthias was no longer the eccentric hermit, wasting hay on foolish construction. He became the man who had solved a critical frontier survival problem. Trappers and settlers who had mocked his project now asked for advice. The transition from ridicule to respect happened quickly once performance data replaced aesthetic judgment. Not everyone adopted the technique. Some trappers remained committed to traditional log construction. Others could not afford the upfront investment in hay bales. Some simply preferred familiar methods despite their limitations. Innovation adoption was never universal or immediate, but enough people recognized the value that hay bale insulation became an established option rather than an absurd experiment. Matthias helped several builders with their projects through summer and fall of 1843. He refined his techniques based on feedback and variations others tried. The collaborative improvement process made the insulation method more practical and accessible. What had started as one man's desperate response to tragedy became a shared body of frontier knowledge about thermal management and survival construction. Matthias Reinhardt continued trapping in the Bitterroot Valley until 1849, when declining fur prices and advancing age pushed him toward different work. He took a position at a trading post near Missoula, married a widow named Catherine Albrecht in 1851, and spent his later years in modest comfort, far removed from mountain isolation. He died in 1873 at age 61, buried in a small cemetery outside Missoula, with no mention on his gravestone of hay bales or thermal engineering. But his innovation persisted in the mountains and settlements where winter cold remained a lethal threat. The hay-wrapped shelter he had built in 1842 stood for 19 years before the metal finally corroded beyond repair. The hay insulation outlasted predictions, remaining effective for 7 years before Matthias replaced it completely in 1849. Later occupants maintained the structure through the 1850s using Matthias's documented techniques. Hay bale insulation spread beyond the Bitterroot Valley through the 1840s and 50s. Trappers, miners, and settlers moving through Montana Territory carried knowledge of the technique to new locations. Variations appeared in Wyoming, Idaho, and the Dakota Territories. Some applications were sophisticated and comprehensive, like Matthias's original design. Others were crude additions to existing structures. All shared the core principle that compressed hay interrupted thermal conductivity and saved lives in extreme cold. The technique proved particularly valuable in mining camps where men needed temporary shelter in exposed locations. Miners built quick structures using available materials and insulated them with hay bales purchased from nearby ranches or settlements. These insulated shelters allowed mining operations to continue through winter in locations where conventional cabins would have been inadequate. The economic impact was significant, though never formally calculated. Modern historians estimate that hay bale insulation techniques derived from or inspired by Matthias's work contributed to survival of several dozen people through extreme weather events in the mid-1800s. The exact number is unknowable because survival rarely generates written records. But period accounts reference insulated shelters weathering storms that killed occupants of conventional structures nearby. Each survival represented validation of principles Matthias had discovered through grief, observation, and systematic experimentation. The broader legacy extended beyond immediate survival applications. Matthias demonstrated that frontier innovation did not require formal education or sophisticated tools. Careful observation, logical thinking, and willingness to challenge conventional methods could solve problems that traditional approaches had failed to address. His hay-wrapped shelter proved that thermal management was engineering, not luck, and that systematic application of understood principles produced measurable superior results. The story illustrates how personal tragedy can drive innovation that benefits communities far beyond the original innovator's awareness. Matthias built his hay insulation to survive after watching Ernst die. That individual motivation created a technique that spread across territories and saved lives for decades. Innovation often begins with specific local problems and expands to general solutions when the underlying principles are sound and the need is widespread.